Okay, hello everyone and welcome to Knowledge at Noon. I am Jenna Harris, the Education Manager for Yolo Arts. Just a reminder, please mute your microphone and video so that we can ensure a smooth streaming experience for everyone joining today. Before we get started, I have a few announcements to make. Yolo Arts' current exhibitions, Art Farm at the Barn Gallery closes next Thursday on November 18th. And Sweet at Gallery 625 closes on November 30th. So be sure to see them before they're gone. The Barn Gallery is open Thursdays from 2:30 to 5 p.m. and Gallery 625 is open Monday through Friday, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. Please be sure to wear a mask while you're visiting. Also, our Dorothy Peterson Arts Grant is now open and accepting applications. This grant supports K through 6th grade teachers in Yolo County for an art and agriculture lesson. The deadline to apply is January 24th, and the grant is funded by Art Farm 2021. There will be a moderated Q&A at the end of today's talk. If you would like to submit a question, please click on the chat icon at the bottom of your computer screen, or if you're joining us by phone, by clicking More and then Chat. During the presentation, I will monitor your questions and compile them to discuss with our speaker at the end. And now I would like to introduce our speaker, Shirley DicKard. Shirley is the great-granddaughter of Yolo pioneer and activist Emily Hoppin and is a fourth-generation Californian. Both sides of her family came to California with the 1849 gold rush. She grew up near Sacramento, attended UC Davis, and then got her BS in nursing at the UC Medical Center in San Francisco. As a nurse, she has worked primarily with women, children, and community health. Shirley is now retired and living in the Sierras, 2 hours east of Woodland, on the small homestead she and her husband built as part of the Back to the Land movement in the 1970s. She is senior editor of the Camptonville Courier, a volunteer-run community newspaper, an avid gardener, and a naturalist. Her great-grandmother, Emily Hoppin, was the inspiration for her novel, Heartwood, For Women, For the Earth, For the Future. National winner for visionary fiction from the National Indie Excellence Award, and finalist for the Eric Hoffer Montaigne Medal for thought-provoking books. Heartwood is a historic futuristic story inspired by Shirley's Gold Rush heritage, closeness to nature, value of community, and her belief in the collective power of feminine energy to protect the earth. Shirley, thank you so much for joining us today. Shirley, I think you're muted.
Okay, so excuse me for a minute. I'm glad to be here, but I need to get my slideshow up and going, which I am doing right now. So just a minute. All these new things that we're learning with the Zoom technology. It's wonderful. But okay, here I am. First of all, I want to thank the Yolo Arts for inviting me. I think it's a real honor to be included in their Knowledge at Noon program. And I also want to thank the Camptonville Community Center for letting me use their high-speed internet. I'm in their very small little history room. Yeah, I've got historical pictures around me, so I feel right at home. So thank you to them. And let me get going here. So this is a presentation about my great-grandmother, Emily Hoppin, and I'd like to introduce you to her life and stories and the things that I have learned over the, well, almost 30 years of learning and researching her life. But I grew up with my grandmother telling stories about Emily. And what she used to tell us about was how she ran the ranch in Yolo single-handedly after her husband died. And she took on the saloons during Prohibition, and she was known as a woman of principles. So back in the 1980s, with the rise of feminism and women growing into new power, great-grandmother became, for me, quite a feminist legend in our family. And you know that question, if you could go back in history and talk to somebody or have dinner with them, hands down, it would be my great-grandma, Emily Hoppin. This is Emily Hoppin's youngest daughter, Dorothea. We call her Grandma ... And Grandma ... was a change of life baby. Emily already had her family. She had 4 children, They were 11 to 18 years old, and she thought she was done raising her family. And up comes this new pregnancy. And according to my grandma, her mother cried every day of her pregnancy. This picture on the left is of Grandma Dot Dot reading one of the first Ms. magazines back in the 1970s. And you can kind of see Bette Midler on the cover. Grandma was very interested in what women were doing nowadays. She was also a very elaborate storyteller and made her mother larger than life. So growing up, like I said, my first impressions were that great grandma was a farm woman, a prohibitionist, and a club woman. Now, I wasn't quite sure what club woman meant, but I knew my mother belonged to a bridge club and a dance club, so I figured it was something like that. It turned out to be a huge understatement, which I'll tell you about as we get further along. So in 1876, when Grandma was 81 years old, I sat down with a tape recorder and I wanted to capture these stories because she had all these stories about the people and the places and the events of early Yolo turn of the century, and living on the farm with her mother and so forth. So I interviewed, transcribed them into a book, and which I called The Home Place. And I don't know if you can see it, but I'll be referring to this. I gave copies to all the family members. And I also have a copy at the Yolo Archives. It is also on my website. So if you want to read more, you can peruse it on my website. So because of my interest in her, I was also given Emily Hoppin's personal scrapbook, which I don't have here because it's very fragile, but it's a gold mine of her speeches and papers and newspaper clippings of her campaign for Federation presidency. And all this could have been lost if it had just been kept in somebody's closet. So I was very thankful to have it. And then, as you'll also see, I was able to do something with it through the archives. But I had all this information about her. So I thought, well, I really should write up the story of her life, write her biography. And that's what I did, but not exactly in the way that I anticipated. Here's what happened. Life became the seed for a historical eco-speculative fiction novel. Now, writing a novel was never, ever on my radar. So how did this happen? Okay. I started to write her biography, and it seemed like back in the day, in the 1980s and 90s, the information I had, it wasn't enough to really write a book of widespread interest. I mean, she did live in a very important time when there was a lot going on, a lot of fights for women's suffrage and against prohibition and so forth. So I began asking, well, what's the larger context of Emily's life? How does her life relate to us today? So then I thought, okay, I will write a book about contrasting her life and my life today, because I'm also a back to the lander and involved with concerned with social issues. Well, one night, so I went on like that for a while. One night, everything changed because I was visited by the future. And this is what happened. About 3 a.m, this kind of apparition stood at the foot of my bed, very briefly, introduced herself. She said she was Amisha, my great granddaughter from the future, not yet born yet. And she said that if I'm going to write about the past and the present, that I have to include the future in the story, because everything that we did back then, everything we're doing now, is creating the world that she's living in. And she was asking for help, basically, because she could see the way things were going. She was living the way things were going. So Heartwood evolved to become the legacy. I started out with a legacy of an ancient woman, Shema'a, who saw the earth's demise at the hands of man. We all see it every day today, even. And she sent her warning and a message of hope forward in time within the heart of an acorn. So I interwove the stories of 3 family women. I kind of braided them together, past, present, and future, past, present, and future. They were all mysteriously connected by the old family desk that they inherited. And each woman deals with the issues of her time, and sometimes even cross over time and space to help each other out. So as you can see, we've got Eliza, the post-gold rush, Sacramento 19th century. And this is where Emily Hoppin's story lives. I pretty much was as true as I could to her story. Harmony is a Back to the Land homesteader. That could be my memoir, but it's also everybody that came up with us at the same time. And then Amisha, Dystopic San Francisco. I had her be a pediatric doctor so she could look at the health impacts of what we're creating. So you can see on the bottom that there's national awards, and Jenna mentioned those already. But I was really proud of those. In researching Emily, I started with just the facts about her life. So nearly 10 years of, quote, living in her skin, I really got a sense of what she cared about, how she thought, how she made her decisions, and the tremendous amount of focus and energy that she had. So I took all this and I wove it into the fictional version of her life, which, as you know, historical fiction is really factual history embellished with imagination. So here I am talking full circle back, talking about her biography, which is kind of like where I came in, right? I started with the family sources. I had my great-grandfather's letters home from the gold rush, which were transcribed by my grandfather. Then I have the oral history, the home place, which I referred to already, and then the scrapbook. So I had that to begin with. And I started doing research on the internet. But back in the 1990s, 1980s, there was hardly anything. You really had to drive in person to go to a research site. Now, I think the last time I Googled Emily Hoppin Yolo, there were like 240 references to her. And a lot of those are just like, Emily Hoppin attended the meeting, but a lot of them are her full verbatim speeches, and like this on the right, the internet research of the new executive and feminine club woman. That was on the internet. And I'll refer to that again because it's an amazing glimpse into who she is. So I visits, and I've been visiting the Yolo County Historical Archives for, I don't know, I would say 20, 30 years. It started out, it was just a little tiny warehouse, a room in a warehouse. And now, of course, it's this big center. On the bottom left is Heather Langtop, who is scanning Emily's fragile scrapbook there at the archives, a professional oversized scanner. And that was such a gift to me because now I have, and everybody has digital copies. You can just scan through on your computer and I don't have to touch the fragile copies. So the Yolo Archives has those. I have parts of them on my website. They're too big to put the whole thing in, but if anybody would like a copy of them, I'd love to send them a copy of her, the insides of her scrapbook. Then whenever I was traveling and got a chance, I would do some research, such as the top middle historic records room in Winnemucca, Nevada. There was a mysterious gap in her story, which I won't go into too much, but she and her husband spent a year and a half raising sheep in Nevada on their way to California. So it's like, what? But anyway, it's all documented, so it's there. I don't know much about it yet. The bottom picture is the California Trail Interpretive Center out of Elko, Nevada. If you're ever in Nevada, I highly recommend that. It's not a museum, it's an interpretive center. So you experience what it's like to go from the east to the west to California on the Overland Trail. Then on the far right is the Gibson House Historical Museum. And I took a lot of photos of that, which I will show you in my next slide. But each of these kind of filled in a piece of the puzzle. No, that's not my next slide. Where's my next slide? Here it is. Okay. So, like I said, I took all these photographs and kind of kept them as part of my storyboard in my mind, is for the settings of Emily's story or Eliza's story. So if you have read the story, you might notice on the left, there's the living room, the three windows that plays a part in one of the parts of the story. Then there's the her desk. This is not her desk, but it's the desk. And then the staircase where she walks down. I refer to that several times. Then there's the guest room with the nightgowns spread out to show that they were always ready for guests. And I have this little piece I would like to read from the oral history of Grandma talking about that. No, I have it. Anyway, she said that put away somewhere. I don't know where it is. Anyway, she said that, oh, I know, all the old timers knew each other, Grandma said. She said, instead of going to a hotel, you went instead to who was considered the leading person in the community. Where we would go to a hotel, they would go to a friend's house to stay. So I have a scene in there where Scrappy comes and she puts them up in the guest room. Okay, so Emily's background. She was born in 1854 in Niles, Michigan, to well-educated parents. Her father was Nathaniel Bacon. He was a judge of the Michigan Supreme Court. Her mother was Carolyn Lord Bacon. She was very well read, very well traveled, and always a friend to those in need. So there were always people coming by for help or conversation with her. Emily's father insisted that she have an extensive four-year classical education. So they sent her to the Michigan Female Seminary in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And in the middle, there's a copy of the curriculum. You can't really read it, but it includes ancient English and French history, literature, poetic works, rhetoric, composition, mathematics, all kinds of sciences. It was amazing. I mean, I would have loved to have had that education. But this education will show up later in her writing and her speeches, and particularly when she starts to give advice to farmers on what they should be reading. It's kind of funny. Okay, later in 1915, the San Francisco Chronicle described Emily as one of the most brilliant women in the state, able to speak on any subject that may be presented. And you can kind of understand why. So one of the family stories that I love to tell, and I don't know, I think there's a family member in the audience, I don't know if he's heard this story or not, but when Emily was just an infant, the Bacon family was visited by an old family friend named Charles Hoppin, who had immigrated to California during the gold rush in 1849. Well, he was 27 years old when he came back, and he held this baby Emily on his knee, and he said to her parents, I'm going to wait for her. And that's exactly what he did. 20 years later, he came back from California and asked her to marry him. She was 20 years old, he was 47, and you'll find this story tucked into Heartwood. So in 1847, she married and left everything for California. So those are the facts. And that's all you get from documents. But in my mind, I'm thinking, what was in her mind when she left her mother, left her father, left the high school that she was teaching at, all of her friends, to go with this man that she didn't know that well, to California that she didn't know that well? So it was kind of like, this is a big step for a young woman. So I wrote a fictionalized version in that, trying to get under her skin as to why she would do that. Okay. Much was recorded in her early California years, up to about from 1874 to 1895. But according to the oral history that I have of her, from her daughter, Dorothea, her life revolved around running the household and raising children. She had Harriet, Edward, Edith, Dorothea. So this is her daily schedule that I kind of put together from the grandmother told us. And I'm not going to read it all because you can read it, but the things that I want to point out is 5 o'clock in the morning, she would get up to get her butter and fryers on the 6 a.m. train to the Palace Hotel in San Francisco. Grandma loved to tell that story, various versions of it. But she also got up to make all the food for the hired hands and for the guests that were there. So then she served breakfast and so forth. She joined her guests at 8 in the morning and joined them for breakfast, although she had eaten earlier. Around 11, she did some of her chores. She had a different chore every day that she would do. And then what I particularly love is from 1:30 to 5, she worked at her desk. And I like that she carved out the largest part of her day for her writing. And this is when she wrote her speeches and her presentations and all the different things that you will hear about a little bit later and that are on my website. So she included, there were lots of stories in the home place about farm life and food preparation and politics and all stories about the farm hands and so forth. But I'm going to read a story about that she told me about Borich's General Store. I hope I said that right. It was founded in Yolo in 1875. So Grandma was saying, okay, in those days, you got your bill at the end of the year. We had a book. And as a little girl, I remember my mom saying, you have the book? If you bought anything at the Borich store, you had him write it in your book and what you had bought and the cost of it. And then at the end of the year, he added up his book and my mother added up her book. And believe me, the two of them better coincide because then they went over it bit by bit. Well, that Charlie bought this. Well, what'd you let Charlie buy it for? You know, he wasn't allowed to charge things. I bought a pair of shoes or something, and all those things were written there in the book. You paid for it at the end of the year. Then after you paid for it, Mrs. Borich, who was a little French Jewish woman, oh, she was charming. After you paid the bill, she'd say, well, now, Mrs. Hoppin, what would you like for a gift? Would you like a piece of linen? Mother would always say, oh, I would. She would give you about a 3-yard beautiful linen tablecloth. You could get everything in the store, from beautiful damask linen or Irish linen to any kind of nails or tape. Some people said they even had coffins. I never saw any. He had a barrel of candy, horehound candy, and the youngsters were always given a piece of the hard candy when they went in. But Mr. Borich finally closed the store. I think he'd been there 75 years. Actually, his sons closed it in 1963. It was the end of an era. Because when I tell people we paid by the year, they just won't believe it. So I don't know if anybody remembers the Borich store. I have the newspaper article at the closing of it. Here's Emily's scrapbook. This is a page from maybe the first third of it. And like a lot of women, I think Emily was originally involved and focused on her home and her children. And that kind of is reflected in her scrapbook. There's a lot of poetry and prose, mainly sentimental stuff about children and motherhood and nature and death. And I kept thinking I would find something that I loved, but it wasn't quite my style. And then about a third of the way through, you'll see this picture of a woman who was a secretary at the WCTU. And you're like, oh, okay, things are starting to change here. About the last 2/3, there were included a lot about the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the California Federation of Women's Clubs, obituaries, and long printouts of her speech and papers, most of them laced with a lot of poetry and quotations. So Emily was very active and she fought for prohibition, and she helped form the Yolo County WCTU in 1887, and she was the president for 3 years. Well, the turn of the century in Woodland, the population was 3,000 people. It's not big, but there were 40 saloons. 20 of those bars or saloons were on one street alone. So I try to imagine a little town of 3,000 people with 40 Starbucks in it. It's like, you kind of get the impact of the saloons. The saloons were where a lot went on, a lot was decided, and a lot happened. My grandma would talk about the saloon vote because the supervisors would sell their vote to the highest bidder, who were, of course, all infused with alcohol and outbidding each other. So the decisions weren't made in a rightful way. So the men would drink their earnings and go home, and they'd inflict physical and emotional abuse on their wives and their children. And there were shootings, murders, robberies, almost daily occurrences. So both Emily and her husband were against alcohol. And that's the reason why they didn't move closer to Woodland, because they didn't want their children growing up in that impact. But I want to read another story about how, even though Emily was against alcohol, she cared more about the principle of honesty. So this is one of our favorite stories that Grandma used to tell us over and over. Well, the farm hands would ring the bell for everything. I remember they rang the bell and I went out and they said they wanted to talk to Mrs. Hoppin. Well, Mother said, well, what in the world? So she went out, and of course she was big and she got tired. So she was sitting on the edge of the wood box. Of course, I sneaked into the pantry and I pulled the sliding door a little bit so I could hear. My brothers and my sisters were right behind me. As we were listening, it seems the local woman in the hotel saloon was overcharging the men. They'd give her a $20 gold piece, and Vernie, this woman who operated the place, she'd say, "No, you gave me $1," and she'd give them change for $1. Well, some of the men, they knew that they were getting cheated, and they were getting madder the minute. They told my mother about it, and of course, my mother said, well, that was a grave charge to make. So she said, a couple of you will have to stay sober or be sick or be something, but you stay sober and you make a note of everything that happens. So they watched and they kept track of how the woman shortchanged the men. So then my mother went down and sent word for Vernie to come out and told her that she was wise to the fact that she was shortchanging the men. If she heard another complaint, she would see to it that she was out of business. So this was, even though she was active in the WCTU, she was still concerned that her men got their money's worth of alcohol. She wasn't going to have them cheated. And there was this one old saloon keeper, John Huckey from the Bucket of Blood, and he said to me years later, when your mother told us she was going to put us out of business, we knew we were going out of business because she could rally all the old timers, the people who had come in and settled there in the early community. She could unite the temperance people and the farming people, and you just didn't have a prayer. These three women we called the Three Musketeers. There was Mrs. Lawhead, who was the vice president of the Woodland High School, and there was Mrs. Houston, who published this Home Alliance, and there was my mother. They called them the Three Musketeers. Well, as history went on, the women got the right to vote, finally, in California in 1911, and things finally changed. With 400 new women voting, they voted unanimously to close down the saloons. So I say, no wonder men didn't want the women to vote, right? Now, because Charles was 27 years older than Emily, they knew he would probably go first. So they decided she was not going to be a helpless widow. She would learn how to run the farm. So the next year she was in training, and Charles taught her everything she needed to know about running an 800-acre farm. Charles died in 1903. Emily was 49 years old. After his death, she blossomed into community work. She got involved with Prohibition, the Federation. She was the board president of this and that on the board of directors. She went around the state giving speeches while running a highly successful farm. And in the middle picture, there's a little frame, 1912, and it says in the bottom, Mrs. Emily Hoppin of Woodland is leading a California Federation of Women's Clubs drive to have women placed on state boards. About time to get women on those decision-making boards. Emily was also very passionate about country life, and especially getting women into farming. She wrote many papers and speeches for the California Fruit Growers Association and Woodlands Farmers Institute. And she would often write how women could start up their own farms, and even invited women to come live with her, and she would teach them all that they needed to know. So here's a sample of the speeches that I have posted on my website, shirleydickard.com, under historical research. They are The Country Life, Literature on the Farm, Can Women Succeed in Horticulture, Women as Farmers, Diversified Farming, 25 Acres Enough, and The Farm That Pays. And those are just the ones that I know. So even back then, people were migrating away from the farms and into the cities because of long hours, hard work, and little pay. Emily said that the only way to have, and she called it the back to the farm movement. I don't know if she coined that term or one she was just quoting, but she said people have to learn to love the land. And that's what we should be teaching children. She always brought a spirit of lyrical eloquence to her writing about farming. And in a little bit later, I'll show you what she wrote to the farmers about what they should be reading. But this is an excerpt from one of her speeches on country life that she was delivering to the Fruit Growers Convention. But this is, she just wove these little bits of eloquence in. She said, There will always be in my mind the picture of those beautiful mornings when the earth was just awakening from the night's sleep, when the clouds lay in long bars across her breast, when in the distance the snowy Sierras snowed white and crimson and gold as the rays of the morning sun touched their summits. These were mornings to remember. That's what she meant by loving the land. So this is one of my favorite parts of her speech on what farmers should be reading. And all the books on this page are, my book is on the bottom left, but all the rest of the books belong to my cousin Jim Moffat, who lives on the East Coast now. But we're very fortunate to have saved them. He was called by my cousin, who wasn't that much of a reader. She said, she lived in Nevada, and she said, could you come and look at this box of books I have out in my shed? It was kind of rained on and dirty and mildewy. And she said, I don't know what to do with these. I'm just going to dump them. And so he looked at them and he went, oh my goodness, those are Emily Hoppin's private library books. So he grabbed them and took them home and cleaned them up. And they are now in a front and center part of his library. They're one of his most valuable possessions. So you can kind of read the things. I'm going to read them out loud because I just think these are just wonderful. This is what Emily told farmers that they should have. Every home needs some books in sight, just as sometimes we need our friends in sight. 2 books should be the nucleus for the farm library, Shakespeare and the Bible. And then she listed a bunch of other ones too. But she said they need to be small versions you can hold in your hand. And so you can always take them with you. And then she said you need to have at least 1 good magazine devoted to synopsis of current events, as well as a farm paper, city paper, and town paper. The Bible says, as a man thinketh in his heart, so he is. Prefix the words, as a man readeth in his newspaper, so thinketh he. These are words for today, right? Try to find a daily paper if you can that devotes 2/3 to good things and 1/3 to bad things. Do not be afraid to show hospitality to new ideas. Remember that the radical of today is a conservative of tomorrow. And then last, remember that books, like friends, can stand a good light, the open fire in the winter, the piazza in the summer, and in the evening, a clear, shaded lamp. So further in the scrapbook, we start to see clippings of the California Federation of Women's Clubs. The Federation was organized in 1900, and women couldn't vote. And so this is one of the ways that women organized in groups of clubs to get things done. And on the right is a little piece that I put inside the front pages of my book, written by Deborah Bushnell of the Federation, and about how she was struck by the similarities of women in Heartwood with all the women involved in the California Federation. From the beginning, women like Emily Hoppin, they were and are the backbone of every part of our lives, be it home, business, social, or political. In the early days, women were considered second-class citizens, but Emily rose above the norm of her day and was a shining star. So Emily was the president, the vice president. She was all sorts of officers. But then at one point, she started a whole new chapter in her life, and this is 1915. And without the scrapbook, we wouldn't have known about this. So I consider this a real gift to history. The way the Federation works was that every 2 years, they elect a president, and it rotates north and south. So the South nominates their president, the North nominates their president. Well, for some reason, the North had their president-elect that they were nominating. That was Mrs. Jones of Oroville. But for some reason, the Shakespeare Club of Woodland decided to put up Emily Hoppin as an alternative candidate to be voted on. Now, I don't know if that's regular or irregular, and I've been trying to pin that down through research, and I'm hoping that somebody in the Shakespeare Club of Woodland, I know they still exist, can help me out with researching their old records to find out why, if they didn't like the candidate, or if they really wanted Emily Hoppin. I don't know. They wanted the rural vote, I think. Anyway, the papers were agog. It was like it hit the front pages of the San Francisco Chronicle and so forth about the fight in the women's club. And this is what one of them wrote in the, I think it was the San Francisco Chronicle. Just what will happen when Greek meets Greek? In other words, when the Jones faction meets the Hoppin faction at the state convention this week, it's impossible to conjecture, but it certainly promises to be the fiercest clash in the Federation's history. The 100 supporting Mrs. Jones have no intention of yielding an inch, nor have the enthusiastic admirers of Emily Hoppin shown any signs of eliminating themselves. As a consequence, the only means of capturing the presidency is by storm. And in storming, it is predicted that friendships and feelings are to be bruised, while at the same time, that general harmony aimed at the basic idea of our federation is going to be punctured. Calm arbitration at this late date is apparently impossible, and the atmosphere is blue with a wave of expectant irritation. So that was kind of the tone of the articles that were in the newspapers. But what happened was, in a huge upset victory, Emily won. And it was basically, she was running on the rural woman, the country woman's platform. But she was very articulate, very intelligent, and people loved her. So she got to work. She immediately wasted no time and set to work, and that was mid-May. So she was finally had the power to put all of her vision and action into work, into action, yeah. And she worked tirelessly, which unfortunately was to be her undoing. The Overland Monthly, that article that I referred to earlier, published a 4-page interview. And I can't read this on the slide, but I put out these 3 extras, and these are on my website, but it shows she had something to say about the country woman, about water as the fountainhead of California's prosperity. This is 1915, and peace, which she feels must be largely women's work. So one of the conundrums I faced in writing my book, Heartwood, is that all of the women, the way my book was written, were facing environmental issues of their times, such as deforestation, drought, wildfires, proposed dams, severe decline in fertility and children's health. And up to that point, I knew Emily mainly as a social activist, prohibitionist, clubwoman, and so forth. And I thought, oh, well, it's fiction. I can do whatever I want, can't I? Well, it turns out I didn't have to, because the more I researched, the more I found that Emily was indeed concerned with the environment, concerned with the land. And she was concerned about starting a state parks system. And she even supported John Muir in his campaign against the putting a dam across Hetch Hetchy in Yosemite. So I found many other references since then. So I feel vindicated, like I was on the right track after all. So this article describes her plans about how much she wanted to get done. 6 weeks after being elected, she held her first board meeting in San Francisco on July 30th. Sadly, it was also to be her last. On the train home to Woodland, Emily started feeling ill. So Dorothy and the family met her at the train station. Knowing something was wrong, they whisked her home. When I interviewed my grandma Dot about this part, she said she remembers it in great detail as if it happened just yesterday, because she was the only child who still lived at home. And so I tried to be as true to the details she told me as possible. Once they got Emily home and in bed, they called for Dr. Lawhead, who quickly arrived at her bedside. He said that Emily was suffering from sheer exhaustion, and she had a hard time breathing. She was also a very large woman, I will say, so her heart really had to work extra hard. He put her on strict bed rest, and she was not even allowed to write or even dictate to the club women, which frustrated her to no end. On the 3rd day, she was getting worse, and against her wishes, she was taken in a horse-drawn ambulance to the hospital in Woodland. Now that was a 2-hour trip in the summer heat, and that must have been really, really difficult. However, in my book, Heartwood, I actually let her stay at home and die at home because I knew that's really what she wanted. So this is what I wrote in Heartwood. This is what she wrote. This is what she said to Dottie. She said, And this is based almost on her words verbatim. If this is death, then this is where I shall remain, she whispered to Dorothea. Where you took your first breath and Silas his last, I will be among my women. So on the fourth day, August 4th, she died of heart failure caused by exhaustion. Newspapers all over the state spread the news about her passing, and Dorothy pasted all those obituaries into Emily's scrapbook. So we have a huge selection of them, although I found even more on the internet. People were shocked and saddened at losing their beloved Emily, who was the leader of thought in California, they said. And I think we have time. I'm going to read just a little tiny piece in my book about that part, where it's sort of an offstage where the three women, Eliza, Harmony, and Amisha, are all talking offstage at Emily's funeral, at her lying in at the farmhouse. Eliza Baxter never believed in rumors that the dead hung around the living for 3 days, occasionally attending their own funeral. Yet here she was, inspecting every detail from afar with detached scrutiny. Why, it didn't feel the least bit like haunting. Seems like the whole town has come to see you off, said Amisha, flinging her braid over her shoulder. But the newly deceased was too distracted with all the black coats and veils entering her front door. And my house is such a mess. Mrs. Archer doesn't clean until next week, Eliza moaned. Bad timing, said Harmony. You should have had all your and you with all your silver unpolished. Well, maybe you should have followed your instincts and polished them yourself, Amisha said. We all think we have more time, and then sometimes, poof, we're gone. Well, how could I die when I was getting to the most important work in my life? Must have been a mistake, Eliza said. Oh, I don't know. Are there mistakes? Amisha turned to Harmony. Harmony shrugged, and the three women settled into a prolonged silence. At last, Amisha spoke. You saw her, of course. Eliza didn't reply. That old woman who placed the acorn there beneath your crossed hands. See how Dottie lifted and reset your hands just now? I don't believe Dottie saw it, Harmony said. No, she couldn't have. I've seen that woman before, Eliza said, as if unraveling a dream. We all have. So the old woman they were referring to was Shema'a, the woman who started the beginning of the book with her legacy of sending her message forward to the future in the form of an acorn. So fiction has the power to convey an emotional truth, and enabling readers to hear on an emotional level in a way that just plain facts cannot. I often wonder what my great-grandmother, Emily Hoppin, would think of this book, of hearing her very words echoed 100 years later into the future, as relevant today, some of them, as they were when she spoke. We often really never know the impact of what we do, and yet we do it regardless because it's the right thing to do. So Heartwood, my book, begins and ends with the words Shema'a sent forward to the women in the future, of which that is us. She said, listen to the silence, hold the earth in your hands, gather the women, and do what must be done. So I want to thank the Yolo Arts for this opportunity to come full circle and share my book and share my research and the Emily Hoppin that I've come to know. You can see more photographs and over 30 documents of her speeches and papers are on my website under historical research. And I also have a blog where I write about the many topics that are brought up in this book from the past, the present, and the future. And the latest one was about microplastics and the impact in our environment from top to bottom of our environment. So you have to sign up to follow my blog, which you can sign up on my website. And if you're interested in purchasing Heartwood, you can go to your local bookstore. If it's not in stock, they can easily order it for you. And I am on a campaign to support our local indie bookstores. So that's my first choice for where you buy your books. But you can also buy it on Amazon. You can buy both the ebook, Kindle, and paperback on Amazon. And by the way, it makes a perfect gift. I have been known to mail copies. If people want to email me at heartwoodnovel@gmail.com, we can arrange, I can send you an autographed copy. But if you've already bought the book, or if you're going to buy the book and you'd like to have it autographed, I can mail you an autographed sticker, a label sticker that you can put inside your book. And I also have a few other things, some little surprises I like to include in the book. So anyway, feel free to contact me either through my Gmail or through the website, shirleydickard.com, and also my Facebook page. So thank you. I have really enjoyed spending time here, and I guess it's time for questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Shirley. Just to kick us off, well, first to remind everyone, please feel free to submit any questions you have for Shirley directly in the chat box, and you can find that chat icon on the bottom of your Zoom screen. The first question that we had come in right away was just asking when this talk will be available online. That will be available on the Yolo Arts YouTube channel and the Yolo Arts website, yoloarts.org. It usually takes me a few days to get it up, but by early next week, Monday, it should be live on our website so that you can review the presentation. So jumping into questions here, Shirley, I personally, love the multi-generational approach to the novel, really tying in not just on the strength of women, but the strength that we get through our family connections. And I know from talking with you and from your presentation today that your family was very involved, kind of start to finish for you in this process of not just research, but also, you know, the nitty-gritty nuts and bolts of the story. Can you talk a little bit about how that is? I know, everyone's family relationships is different, so that could be, good or bad working with your family there. But did working with them, did that affect the story at all? And if so, how do you feel like that played out in the novel?
Oh boy. Okay. Well, I have a very supportive family. We have two daughters. They're both married and have children. So, we've got generations. And part of when I wrote the book, I'm thinking, they talk about act as if, you're doing things for your grandmother or your grandchildren, your great grandchildren. So I tried to make this book really relevant to what it would be like for my grandchildren, not only them, but even further down the line for their lives. But I mean, in terms of helping write and produce the book, oh my goodness, I couldn't have done it without them. My daughter, Mariah Lander, did all the art for me. She designed the cover. She got the cover first try. She got what the book was about. And I've had just more comments about the cover and just how captivating it was. She did the internal artwork and the whole cover design. And then it was just really nice to be able to say, oh, hey, Mariah, I need a bookmark. I need a label, and she just whips them out. She's really perceptive. And I think she's actually helped some other people doing some woodland books here too. Her business is blueavocadodesign.net. I hope I got that right, Mariah. If you're still out there, correct me. And then my other daughter is very good with words, very good with editing. And she was one of my early readers. She read, I don't know how many times she read through the copies and all the different versions of the book. And she would often pick up things like, Mom, are you really sure you wanted to say it this way? Nowadays we don't refer to things that way anymore. So, hey, thank you very much. I need to be updated. But she was also just really good at wordsmithing. So I had both of my daughters were very intimately involved. And my husband too. He read, every morning I'd wake up with, I'd come out of my writing room with another chapter and I would give it to him and he'd be my first reader and give me my thumbs up or thumbs down. So yeah, family is very important in the book. Very meaningful to me.
Absolutely. We do have a question coming in from Linnell, who says she enjoyed the book and is wondering if you have any plans to write another.
Oh, that's the big question, isn't it? I'm entertaining the possibility of writing again. This book came out March 2020, just as everything closed down for COVID. So everything kind of closed down. I actually used that year to update my website. I did a lot of things because I couldn't do things in public. I couldn't do book readings and so forth. So now I feel like I'm just kind of getting back a year later, and my book now has legs. And oh my goodness, it's really taking off. So I'm enjoying where it's going. And I'm asking people, what would you want to read? What would you want to read? Either more from this book, more a takeoff from the book, a sequence, what do you call it, a sequel, or something totally different. Anyway, I'm entertaining thoughts.
I love it. I love it. So keep that in mind. If you have pro tips for Shirley, go ahead and put those in the chat, and she can put them in the next novel. We do have a question from Margaret asking where the family farm was located and if the home is still standing.
I have a treasure map that my great uncle drew, John Kurgel, and it's a hand-drawn treasure map. So I have gone out to where the farm was, and it's no longer there, unfortunately. But the 2 palm trees are there, which I guess, I don't know if that was something that everybody did back then. But they put 2 palm trees on the driveway so you could see it way across the fields, across the terrains. That's where the house is. Anyway, the palm trees are still there. There's maybe a barn there. There's a trailer. There's a lot of cars and fences and garbage cans and things like that. I haven't had the nerve to knock on the door. I'm waiting for somebody to take me in hand and lead me over there and introduce me. So I would love to see, maybe they have some artifacts left on the property. I don't know. I know that there's some Hoppins that live in the Woodland area. And I think Dick Hoppin is somewhere in here. I don't know if he has anything to add to that.
Well, in a similar vein, we have another question coming in asking about how many of the relatives are still in Yolo County. And, Dick, so glad to see that you were able to join us today in here as well.
Well, there's a Larry Hoppin and Claire Reed. Claire Reed, her maiden name was Hoppin, I think. Anyway, we used to have family picnics there in the Woodland Park. And everybody would come every year from all over the place. And so I knew all my cousins growing up, and they've all kind of scattered. But I know Claire was always there, and the Hoppin brothers. Yeah, but I don't know if there are other ones. I want to know.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, I will put out kind of a last call for questions from the group here as we're wrapping up. In the meantime, Shirley, there is a lot of, and you talk about this now, about the historical relevance of the book from, past perspectives and then the future perspectives. But really, if we're looking just kind of historically and now, there are really, such grand themes and characters that are very similar or facing similar challenges. Can you speak to maybe approaching that part of the book from an I shouldn't say solely an environmental standpoint, but I feel like that's kind of one of the strong themes that stood out, obviously.
Yeah. Well, I have a number of themes, and where it was relevant, I wove them into each of the characters. Sometimes it was just a passing phrase that they said. And other times it was a huge event, a huge scene, like the building of a dam in the present time. But water and man's use and diversion of water for man's purposes, yes, some of that is absolutely needed, but even Emily Hoppin questioned the rerouting of the Sacramento River and the Army Corps of Engineers cementing in the walls of the river banks and things like that. So use of water, the women's power, where women held power and how they were able to achieve it and use it. And it wasn't actually, it's not women's power, it's really a feminist way of perceiving things and getting things done. So it's not it's not gender related. It's feminine versus masculine. And of course, we each have some of both, but it's emphasizing more, it's time, like great grandma said, peace has to be a woman's issue, a woman's work, because we've tried everything else. So let's let a more feminine perspective come forward, and let's try that for a while and make a different kind of progress. And one of my favorite quotes that somebody reminded me of was that progress looks different when we women follow our own nature. Like, that's part of what's going on with politics right now today. We're not following our own nature, we're following a more masculine setup. Anyway, I won't say more.
I think the sentiment of the feminine power and how it's used differently, you know, feminine power versus masculine power and ways to achieve things, I think is a beautiful sentiment to reflect on and think about. I know it certainly has its own implications in my life and you know, the work that I do in the community, and I do notice those things. So I think it's certainly something that I'd be interested to have a longer conversation around. It's certainly a community conversation, but we are nearing the end of our time here today. Let me go ahead
one
and
last thing.
Let's see. Okay, everyone. So thank you so much for logging on. To learn more or to follow up, please be sure to check out Shirley's website. Her email address is here on the screen, as well as you can follow her on Instagram and on Facebook. And of course, to stay up to date with YOLO Arts and everything that we have going on, please check out yoloarts.org. You can send us an email, ya@yoloarts.org. And of course, follow us on social media at YOLOArtsCA. Thank you so much, Shirley. This was a beautiful presentation. I loved just the connection and connecting back to our wonderful Gibson house and really showing that generational moving forward. So thank you for your time, and thank you everyone for logging on.
Thank you.